Hello, my name is Michael Rather from the Digital Photography Connection, and this video tutorial was especially prepared for PSD TUTs. In today's tutorial, we're going to be talking about the sharpening workflow. In most post-production workflows, it's often recommended that one of the final steps in the post-processing workflow is image sharpening. However, I'd like to suggest that the sharpening workflow in itself is a three-step process rather than a single step. The sharpening methodology that I'm about to share with you came from the writings of the late Bruce Fraser. I have adopted this methodology into my workflow, and my images have improved dramatically. First, let's talk about why we might want to sharpen an image in the first place. During image capture, all digital cameras lose some level of sharpness when the photons are converted to pixels. In fact, most digital cameras today allow you to enhance the capture sharpness via a setting in your camera. I don't use the in-camera enhancements, but rather make my adjustments in post-production. So our first goal in post-processing would be to bring back the image sharpness as seen at the time of capture. We want to do this before making any tonal or contrast adjustments to the image. In fact, viewing an image with the correct capture sharpening might influence how we make our tonal adjustments to the image. So the first step in our three-step process would be capture sharpening. And once again, we want to make our adjustments before making any of those contrast or tonal adjustments to your image. Now, you might be doing this without even knowing it. If you happen to be shooting in the raw format of your camera and you bring your image into Photoshop, what's going to happen is Photoshop is automatically going to apply a level of sharpening through the Camera Raw defaults. Now, you can change the defaults inside of Camera Raw, which is beyond the scope of this video tutorial, but I just wanted to point out to you right now that sharpening, pre-sharpening, is actually going on to the image right when you bring it into Camera Raw. If you happen to be shooting in the JPEG mode, that sharpening is automatically going to be applied in the compressed JPEG image that's created once you snap the shot. In a moment, we're going to bring a raw image into Camera Raw, and we're going to actually modify some of these sharpening settings. And we're going to talk a little bit about what these settings actually do. If you happen to have an image that you shot in JPEG and you'd still like to do a little bit of pre-sharpening, I'm also going to be showing you how you're going to be able to take a JPEG image straight into Camera Raw. Now, there is one word of caution when you're doing pre-sharpening, and that is we want to make sure not to over-sharpen the image. If we start doing creative sharpening at this point in time, we are going to have a over-corrected image by the time we're done with our three-step process. All we're trying to achieve in this step is just to restore some of the natural sharpening that we see in the scene as we snap the shot. Now, once we have our image pre-sharpened, we've got it set up to where it's actually more representative of the image that we took, we're ready to go ahead and start making tonal adjustments to our image. So we can go ahead and make color, contrast, curve type of adjustments to our image. And when we get done with all of the image corrections, then we can go ahead and start looking at step number 2. And step number 2 is creative sharpening. We might want to use creative sharpening to bring attention to particular parts of an image or emphasize specific details of an image. We can achieve this by either doing localized sharpening or, in the case of the image that you're looking here on the screen, more of a global type of sharpening. And here's what I mean. If we happen to be doing a portrait of someone, we don't want to globally sharpen the image. We might want to enhance the eyes, eyebrows, and eyelashes, but we certainly don't want to enhance the pores of the skin. And in those cases, we're going to want to do more of a local type of an adjustment. But the image that you see here on the right could use more of a global type of adjustment which we're going to be doing here later on in this tutorial. And we're not so concerned. In fact, we want to bring out as much detail in this image as possible. So we're going to use more of a global strategy when sharpening the image. Once we have our creative sharpening completed, we're ready to move on to step number 3. And step number 3 is output sharpening. Once we have the image looking the way that we want on screen, we need to consider the medium that we're going to be outputting our image to and the final size of the image. If we're going to be putting the image on a website where it's to be viewed on a screen and we're not going to resize the image, then we're probably done with our sharpening workflow. However, if we make any size changes or if we print to a different medium, say canvas or luster paper, each one of those mediums are going to require a different type of sharpening. It's at this stage where I may create duplicate copies of my finalized image and then sharpen each copy based on the medium where I'm going to actually be outputting the image to. So let's go ahead now and apply these 3 levels of sharpening to one of our images. So I happen to be in Adobe Bridge, and I've got my raw image right here that I want to open into Camera Raw. And since this is a raw image, I can just go ahead and double click on the image, and the image is automatically going to be opened up into Camera Raw. And I'll resize my dialog box here to fit our window. Now, once I open my image into Camera Raw, if I click on this Detail tab right here in the upper right hand corner, you're going to see the sharpening that's automatically applied by default to my raw image. If I happen to be importing a JPEG image into Camera Raw, all of these settings would be set to 0 as the sharpening has already been applied. Now, one of the things that I like to do is to make sure to zoom in on my image just to look at some of the image details. And up here in the upper left-hand corner of the options bar, we've got the zoom tool. We can get there by either clicking on this tool or tapping the Z key on your keyboard. And then I'm just going to go ahead and click and start looking at the image and the image detail. And I want to see if there's any improvements that I want to make or any softness in the image that I want to go ahead and correct before opening this image into Photoshop. Now I'd like to talk about the amount, radius, and detail sliders found here in the detail panel. And to get a better explanation of what these sliders do, I'm going to go ahead for the moment and cancel out of the Camera Raw dialog box, and we're going to come straight into Photoshop on this graphic that I've created. And basically I want to show you what each of these sliders do when you move them inside of either Photoshop or inside of Camera Raw. Now, the basis behind sharpening is really more of an optical illusion, because what's going to happen is Photoshop is going to change the pixels, the adjacent pixels. So when a dark pixel meets a light pixel, the edge of the dark pixels are going to get darker and the edge of the light pixels are going to get lighter, giving us more contrast between the edges. Here, let me show you exactly what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and select my zoom tool. We're going to zoom in here on the edge of this image just a little bit. And I'm going to come up underneath the filter menu and I'm going to drop down to sharpen, and we're going to select unsharp mask. And when we do that, we're going to get the unsharp mask dialog box here. Now you'll see the 3 sliders that we saw when we were inside of Camera Raw. Let me go ahead and zero these 3 sliders out. We can actually only take the radius down to 0.1, but we'll go ahead and move all the sliders here to the left. Now the 3 sliders, the amount slider really stands for what it says, amount. And that is when we move it more from the left to the right, we're going to get more sharpening. However, when I move it from the left to the right and we go clear to 500%, we see very little change here in the line. And that's because we need to use it in conjunction with both the radius and the threshold sliders. Now, the radius slider is going to go ahead and tell us how far from the edge do we want to stray with this change of sharpening. And I'm going to go ahead and just start slowly moving the radius slider from left to right. And as I do, you're going to start to see the edges grow deeper and deeper. Now, obviously, we don't want to sharpen our edges by 500 pixels, nor do we really want to probably stray to 31 pixels as far as the radius goes. But I'm just showing you this here as far as how these two sliders are working in conjunction with each other. The third slider that we have is the threshold slider, and the threshold slider is there to determine how different the sharpened pixels must be from the surrounding area before they're considered edge pixels. And what will happen is when I move my threshold slider here from the left to the right, we're going to start seeing that area change quite a bit because we're starting to tighten down that level of areas as far as how far the pixels are going to stray from the edge. Now, let me give you a couple of really quick settings that I typically use on most images. I typically don't sharpen above about 200%, and a lot of my images I'll be at 100%. And usually my radius, I'll make sure that I'm somewhere between 1 and 3 pixels, although you can go much higher than that here in the Unsharp Mask dialog box. When you're inside of Camera Raw, the maximum pixel radius happens to be 3. And again, this is really more of a pre-sharpening exercise. So if you're trying to do more creative sharpening, you've got more control here in the Unsharp Mask once you're inside of Photoshop. As far as threshold goes, I recommend using a threshold somewhere between 2 and 20 levels. I rarely go above 20 levels of threshold. And of course, you can experiment with that on your various edges. But you can see now we've got the contrast going from our edge here for dark to light, and that's going to give us the illusion of sharpening here on our image. So now that we have a little bit of knowledge about what the individual sliders do, I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this, and let's go ahead and we're going to return back to Adobe Bridge. So I'll bring Bridge back in, and we're once again going to open our raw image into Camera Raw just by double clicking on it. And when we do, we're going to get our Camera Raw dialog box. Once again, to get to the sharpening, we want to click here on the details icon. And here we can see that the amount of sharpening is at 25, the radius is at 1, and the detail, which we didn't see detail in Unsharp Mask, is set to 25. Now, again, the radius only goes up to 3 here inside of Camera Raw. We can't go beyond 3 pixels. Again, this is really a pre-sharpening exercise, and as you'll recall, that's step number 1 in our sharpening workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to accept the defaults for this image. But if you happen to get an image that's looking a little bit on the soft side, you might go ahead and consider playing around with some of the sharpening sliders. Now, you'll want to zoom into your image as you're making these corrections. And if you're using an earlier version of Photoshop, make sure that when you're viewing your image, and you can see down here at the very bottom, we've got a drop-down box, that you're using one of these whole numbers in an increment of 10 or more. You don't want to be looking at an image at 16% or 19% because you're not going to get as accurate a view as you will if you're on one of the numbers that are at least represented in the terms of 10. So you want to be at 50 or 70 or 80 and look around your image. You can pan through the image just by holding the space bar down and then panning through the image. I'm going to go ahead and accept this level of sharpening, and I'm going to go ahead and click and say OK, and now our image is going to open into Photoshop. Now, normally I would do a lot of my contrast and other adjustments inside of Camera Raw and not inside of Photoshop, but that's really not the scope of our tutorial today. We do have other tutorials on how to use Camera Raw, and a lot of my images are actually corrected in Camera Raw and never corrected in Photoshop at all. But let's go ahead. I'm going to bring the layers palette here into view, and let's just go ahead and make a few changes to our image here real quick. I'll go ahead and resize this box just a little bit. And what I want to do right now is I'm going to add a curves adjustment, and we're just going to put a slight S curve on our image. And then next, what I think I want to do is let's go ahead and let's make a vibrance adjustment. And I'm going to go ahead and just pump the vibrance up just a little bit here, and that'll make a nice change. And then I'm going to make a quick saturation change. So I'm going to go to hue saturation, and I'm going to go after the blues channel. And what I want to do with the blues channel is I just want to bring the saturation up just ever so slightly to make the sky just a little bit bluer. And now say we've got our finished image and we're ready to go. And now we're ready to do a little bit of creative sharpening to the image. So now we've done step number one. We've done our pre-sharpening. Then we've gone through and made modifications to our image. And now it's time to apply any creative sharpening that we might want to do to this image. The first thing that I want to do is I want to create a composite of all the changes that I made here in the layers palette, which means what I want to do is select the top layer here, and I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut. If I'm on a Mac, that's going to be Shift Option Command E. If I happen to be in Windows, that's going to be Shift Alt Control E. And that's going to give me a composite layer of all the layers that are visible beneath my composite layer. The next thing that I want to do to this layer is I want to come up under the filter menu, and I want to convert this layer to a smart object. This is going to give me the ability to make sharpening changes to the image. And if I change my mind or want to alter any of those settings, I'm going to be able to easily do that now that this is a smart object. Next, what I'm going to do is come up under the filter menu. I'm going to drop down once again to sharpen, and we are going to select unsharp mask. And what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and zoom in at 100%. I'm also going to grab the zoom tool here. Actually, I'll hold the Z key down. Let me close out of this box. And I want to zoom in as well because I kind of want to see what's going on as I apply this sharpening. What I really want to do on this image, by the way, is I want to enhance the details of the mountain, and we're going to want to sharpen some of those areas, but the areas I don't want to sharpen on this image are going to be the sky and the clouds. There's really no need to sharpen those areas in my opinion. So once again, I'm going to zoom into my image here just a little bit, and I'm going to go under the filter menu, and I'm going to drop down to sharpen, and I'm going to go ahead and select unsharp mask. And of course, we're going to get our three various sliders, and you can begin to see the sharpening effect right away as it's being applied to the image. Well, I'm starting to see some white areas, which is considered ghosting, which means really we've got kind of a halo effect going on the image. We've over sharpened the image at this point. And so there's a couple of things that we can do. We can certainly begin lowering the amount of sharpening that we've applied to the image. We can also start to lower some of the radius or bring some of the threshold up. Again, this is something you're just going to have to play with and get the image looking the way that you want it to look. So I'm going to use a fairly low radius, and again, the preview button, if I click here, that's on and off. That made a little bit of a difference, but I think I can go ahead and bring it up just a little bit more. And that's going to add a little bit of extra emphasis to this area of the image. Now I'm going to go ahead and click and say OK. And what's happened is this image, this sharpness has been applied to the entire image. And as you'll recall earlier, I said I didn't want this to apply to everything. I just wanted to apply to our mountain here. And so I've got a layer mask right here when I created the smart filters that I'll be able to grab my paintbrush and start painting in black on the areas that I don't want to have the sharpening come through. So what I'm going to do is down here in the tools palette, I'm going to make sure that I've got the foreground color set to black. You can reset your colors just by tapping the D key on the keyboard and then just tapping the X key to move the background color from black to the background color will now be your foreground color. And next, I'm going to come up here under the brush and I'm going to make my brush hardness set to 0. I want a very soft brush as I do this. I'm going to go ahead and enlarge the brush. I'm just going to tap the right bracket key on the keyboard, and I'm going to just start painting the areas where I don't want the sharpness to apply. And as we mentioned before, that was going to be the sky. And you can see here in my layer mask as I'm painting on this. Now you want to make sure you're painting on the layer mask. And I know that I'm painting on the layer mask because I see these double lines going around the layer mask box. So I'm just going to go ahead and just quickly paint through. Now I would take a lot more time in my selections here, but for time's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and make some of these quick changes here real quick. And just to show you, now the sharpening is only applied to the areas that we see here in white on our layer mask. So now we've completed step number 2 of our sharpening workflow, and we're ready to move on to step number 3. Now, one of the nice things about this creating this layer as a smart object as we did earlier was now I can go ahead and increase or decrease the levels of sharpness just by going ahead and clicking on the unsharp mask dialog right here. If I double click on it, it's going to bring the sharpness back up, and it's going to show me the exact levels that I currently have on my image. Now it's at this point where I'm going to start evaluating this image and making a decision on where I'm going to start printing this image to. Now if I'm going to be sending this image to canvas, it's not going to look nearly as sharp as it does here on the screen. So I'm going to probably want to increase the sharpness level of the image. And I've got a couple of options that I can do in order to create a separate image. I can either duplicate this sharpened level here. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this level. I'm going to rename this layer the layer of step 2. This will be just step 2 so that I know that it's step 2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the layer, and it is going to over sharpen the image, but then I'm going to turn that layer off, and on this layer I'm going to say canvas. Now what I can do here is I'm going to double click on the unsharp mask, and I know that this image is going to need additional sharpening when it goes to canvas. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to lower some of the threshold, I'm going to bring up some of the amount, and I'm also going to bring the radius up just a little bit. Now this is going to be a trial and error process, but once you start printing to specific mediums, you're going to know how much you need to increase your image by in order to get the results you are looking at here on your screen. You have to be careful not to go too high. We don't want the halo effects because we will get those. But I'm just going to bring up my sharpening just a little bit. And now I'm ready to go ahead and send this image to a canvas print rather than a screen print. And of course we had our step 2. If we ever want to go back to step 2, we can go ahead and turn that on and turn off the canvas sharpening. So I'll create either duplicate images with specific sharpening settings for the medium that I'm going to be printing the image to, or I'll go ahead and just duplicate this smart object layer that I created where I've applied the sharpening on the image, and then make individual sharpening adjustments based on the media that I'm going to be printing the image to. So in a nutshell, that is the 3-step sharpening workflow process that I go through when correcting my images. I did speak earlier, I'm going to go ahead and open up Bridge, but I did speak earlier, if you happen to have a JPEG image, which I have a JPEG copy of this image right here, if you go into Bridge and select that image, then you can go up under the File menu and you can tell it to open that JPEG image up into Camera Raw. And we're going to get the Camera Raw dialog box. And once we click on the Detail slider, once again, as I mentioned before, you can see that we don't have any sharpening applied to this image. It's already been applied in camera. But if you need to make some minor modifications and add a little bit of sharpening to your JPEG images in step number 1, you can certainly do that. Well, I hope this tutorial has been helpful, and I would recommend at least giving this 3-step approach a try. You're probably already using 2 steps in the process, but you might try the 3-step approach to see if you don't get better results from your printed or viewed images.